Daniel clutched the sandwich wrapped in a scrap of paper as if it were the most precious thing in the world. The faint smell of fresh bread and butter tickled his nose, a comforting reminder of his mother's love and sacrifice. Every bite of food in their home came from her hard work, and he knew it. "It's all we have, my son," Maria said softly, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. She placed the sandwich in his hands, brushing her fingers against his for just a moment longer than usual. Her eyes, framed by dark circles of exhaustion, held a deep worry she didn't want to admit. Daniel smiled faintly, trying to lighten her burden. "That's okay. I'm strong." He took a deep breath and added, "Thanks for always taking care of us." Maria smiled back, though the corners of her lips trembled. She reached out and tousled his hair gently. "And you take care of yourself too, okay?" she whispered before turning back to the sink, where a small mountain of dishes awaited her. Her hands worked quickly, her mind likely calculating how to stretch the groceries until the next paycheck. In the corner of the cramped kitchen, Luana, Daniel's 6-year-old sister, sat cross-legged on the floor. Her curls framed her round face as she hummed a made-up tune to her doll, whose left arm was reattached with tape. "Look, Danny," she exclaimed, holding the doll up proudly. "She's all better now." Daniel bent down to admire her handiwork. "You're a great doctor, Lou," he said, ruffling her hair affectionately. The small apartment was clean but worn. The paint on the walls had started peeling years ago, and the furniture was mismatched and secondhand. Yet, the space was filled with warmth, even if the electricity sometimes wasn't. At school, Daniel's reputation was a curious mix. His kindness was well known among his classmates, but so was his simplicity. His worn-out sneakers and patched-up backpack often made him the target of teasing. "Look at that," Lucas, a bigger boy with an expensive backpack, sneered during lunch break. "Does that bag even hold together? Or do you glue it every morning?" Daniel quietly picked up his things without responding. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Lucas taunted. Stepping in front of him, Daniel straightened up and looked him in the eyes. "It's not worth it," he said calmly, brushing past the bully without anger. His tone wasn't defensive, just matter-of-fact. Lucas, unsure how to react, fell silent. After lunch, Daniel stayed back in the classroom, working on a drawing in his notebook. It was a sketch of a sleek bridge spanning a wide river, with numbers and calculations scribbled in the margins. His concentration was so intense that he didn't notice when Mrs. Clara, his teacher, walked up behind him. "That's remarkable, Daniel," she said, studying the intricate details of the sketch. "Do you want to be an engineer when you grow up?" Daniel hesitated, his pencil hovering over the page. "I do, but my mom says we don't have money for stuff like that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't embarrassed, just stating a fact. Mrs. Clara crouched down beside him, her eyes kind. "Listen to me, Daniel. Never underestimate what a determined heart can achieve," she said firmly. Her words stayed with him as he walked home that afternoon, his feet kicking up small clouds of dust on the uneven path. His dreams felt big, almost too big, but he couldn't help imagining them anyway. He saw himself designing towering skyscrapers and bridges that connected far-off cities. But as he approached their apartment building, the weight of reality came crashing back. Inside, Maria was at the table, mending a neighbor's dress for extra cash. Luana sat nearby, scribbling pictures on scrap paper, her tongue sticking out in concentration. Daniel set his bag down and smiled at his mother, even though his stomach growled in protest. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. This was their life, difficult but filled with love. And Daniel, for all his struggles, had a heart so generous that it shone brighter than any dream he could imagine. The sun dipped low in the sky as Daniel walked home from school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The streets of his neighborhood were alive with the usual hustle and bustle of the late afternoon. Children playing with makeshift soccer balls, neighbors chatting over fences, and the distant sound of someone's old radio playing a cheerful tune. Despite the noise, Daniel felt a familiar quietness in his chest. It was the quiet of knowing there wasn't much waiting for him at home. No big meal, no fancy toys, just the usual struggles. But he didn't mind. He had his dreams. And for now, they were enough. As he passed the small park a few blocks from his house, something caught his eye. Sitting on a weathered wooden bench was an elderly man. His clothes were threadbare, his jacket riddled with holes that let the evening breeze through. His hair was gray and unkempt, curling wildly around his face. But what struck Daniel the most was his expression, a mix of exhaustion and something deeper, something almost hollow. The man sat hunched over, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed them together for warmth. A crumpled paper bag sat at his feet, empty and forgotten. Daniel slowed his pace, curiosity pulling at him. He had seen plenty of people pass through this park, but there was something about this man that seemed different. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel called out cautiously, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond at first. His eyes, dull and glassy, were fixed on the ground as if he hadn't heard. Daniel hesitated, but then took another step forward. "Sir," he repeated, his voice softer this time. The man finally looked up, his gaze meeting Daniel's. Up close, the boy could see the deep lines etched into his face, the kind that spoke of years of hardship. His eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something, a mixture of surprise and gratitude at being noticed. "I'm fine, boy," the man said gruffly, though his voice wavered. It was clear he wasn't fine at all. "You don't look fine," Daniel said bluntly, his youthful honesty shining through. "Are you hungry?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. He looked away, ashamed. "I haven't eaten in a while," he admitted after a moment, his voice barely audible. Daniel looked down at his backpack. Inside was his sandwich, the only thing he had to eat until the next morning. His stomach growled in protest, but he ignored it. Without another word, he swung his bag off his shoulder, unzipped it, and pulled out the carefully wrapped sandwich Maria had given him. "It's not much," Daniel said, holding it out, "but it'll help." The man stared at the sandwich as if it were a treasure he didn't deserve. His hands trembled as he reached out to take it. "What's your name?" "Kid," he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Daniel," the boy replied. "What's yours?" The man paused for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Robert," he said finally. "Well, Mr. Robert," Daniel said with a small smile. "It's nice to meet you." Robert nodded, his throat bobbing as he tried to swallow the lump of gratitude threatening to choke him. "Thank you, Daniel," he whispered. "You didn't have to do this." Daniel shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "It's just a sandwich," he said, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. As Robert took his first bite, Daniel watched him closely. There was something about the man's eyes that he couldn't shake, something heavy, as though he carried the weight of 1,000 regrets. "I used to be someone, you know," Robert said suddenly, his voice barely louder than the rustle of leaves in the wind. "A long time ago." Daniel tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Robert shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "Doesn't matter now. People like me, we're just ghosts." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he simply sat down on the bench beside him. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park fading into the background. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though it was the kind that felt oddly peaceful, like an unspoken understanding had formed between them. As the sun dipped further below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Daniel finally stood up. "I have to go home," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Will you be here tomorrow, Mr. Robert?" Robert looked up at him, surprised. "You'd want to see me again?" "Of course," Daniel said with a grin. "You seem nice, and everyone needs a friend, right?" Robert's eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled a real smile. It was small and hesitant, but it was there. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess they do." As Daniel walked away, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He didn't know why, but he felt like meeting Robert wasn't just a coincidence. There was something special about the man, something he couldn't quite put into words. And Robert, watching the boy disappear down the street, felt something stir in his chest, something he thought he had lost a long time ago: hope. The next day, Daniel's thoughts lingered on Robert as he walked to school. He wondered if the man had eaten anything else or found somewhere warmer to rest. The curiosity gnawed at him throughout his classes, even as Mrs. Clara explained the intricacies of fractions on the board. Daniel's mind wandered back to the old man with the tired eyes. When the final bell rang, he didn't head straight home. Instead, he veered toward the park. His heartbeat quickened as he neared the bench where he had met Robert. To his relief, the elderly man was there, sitting in the same spot. This time, however, he was hunched over, coughing into his sleeve. "Mr. Robert?" Daniel called out as he approached. The man looked up, his face lighting up faintly at the sight of the boy. "Daniel," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Back again?" "Huh?" Daniel dropped his backpack on the ground and pulled out a small package wrapped in a napkin. Inside were a few crackers and a piece of cheese he'd managed to save from lunch. "I brought you something," he said, handing it to Robert. "It's not much, but it's more than enough," Robert interrupted, taking the food with trembling hands. He looked at Daniel, his gaze filled with something that was almost reverence. "Why are you doing this, kid?" Daniel shrugged, sitting down beside him. "I don't know. I just feel like you need someone." Robert stared at him for a long moment before chuckling softly. "A kid with more sense than most grown folks," he said, shaking his head. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel made it a habit to stop by the park after school. Each time, he brought something for Robert: a banana, a slice of bread, even a small carton of milk once when his mother wasn't looking. They talked about everything and nothing. Daniel shared his dreams of becoming an engineer, and Robert listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that made the boy feel seen. One afternoon, as Daniel munched on an apple while Robert nibbled on a biscuit, the boy finally asked, "Do you have a family, Mr. Robert?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Robert's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He looked away, his eyes fixed on a patch of dry grass at his feet. "I did," he said after a long pause. "A son?" Daniel perked up, intrigued. "Really? What's his name?" Robert hesitated, his fingers twitching as if grappling with a memory. "Elon," he said finally, the name rolling off his tongue like a ghost he hadn't spoken of in years. Elon was his name. "Where is he now?" Daniel pressed. Robert let out a bitter laugh, his shoulders slumping. "Somewhere far from here. He's important now. Smart, talented, a man who's changed the world. And me." He gestured to his worn-out clothes and the bench beneath them. "I'm just a failure he doesn't need to remember." Daniel frowned, confused. "But he's your son. He should want to know you." Robert shook his head. "It's not that simple, kid. I wasn't there for him when it mattered. I made mistakes. Big ones. And now it's better this way. He has his life. And I have mine. But you miss him, don't you? Robert's silence was all the answer Daniel needed. The boy leaned forward, his voice firm. If you miss him, you should try to talk to him. Maybe he misses you too. Robert gave him a sad smile. You've got a good heart, Daniel. But some things can't be fixed, no matter how much you want them to be. Daniel crossed his arms, unconvinced. That's what my mom says when I break something at home. But I always find a way to fix it. Robert chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. You've got the optimism of youth, kid. Don't lose that. As the sun began to set, Daniel stood up and grabbed his backpack. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Robert. And maybe one day, you'll let me help you fix things with your son. Robert watched him go, the boy's words echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder just a little if maybe the boy was right. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel and Robert's connection deepened. The once cautious exchanges became heartfelt conversations, and the park bench transformed into a place of quiet refuge for both. Daniel found comfort in Robert's wisdom, while Robert found hope in Daniel's youthful determination. One afternoon, Daniel arrived with his school books tucked under his arm. He plopped down on the bench beside Robert, letting out an exaggerated sigh. Rough day, kid, Robert asked, eyeing the boy with curiosity. Math, Daniel groaned, dropping the book onto his lap. Fractions, decimals, I don't know how anyone figures this stuff out. Robert chuckled, a sound that came more easily these days. Let me see, he said, motioning for the book. Daniel handed it over, watching as Robert flipped through the pages with surprising familiarity. The old man's hands, though weathered and calloused, moved with precision. Here, Robert said, pointing to a problem. It's simpler than it looks. The trick is to think of it like cutting a pie. Ever split a pie into slices? Daniel's brow furrowed. Yeah, Robert leaned closer, his voice steady and patient as he explained. To Daniel's amazement, the once impossible problems began to make sense. Wait, Daniel said, his eyes lighting up. You're really good at this. Mr. Robert, were you a teacher or something? Robert hesitated, a shadow crossing his face. Not quite, he said, but I worked with numbers, science, engineering, that kind of thing. Daniel's jaw dropped. You were an engineer? Robert shrugged. Something like that. That's amazing, Daniel exclaimed. Why didn't you ever tell me? The old man looked away, his gaze distant. It's not something I like to talk about, he said quietly. I had opportunities, chances to do something great, but I made mistakes. Daniel, big ones. And I paid the price. Daniel frowned, unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask more, but something about Robert's tone told him it wasn't the right time. Instead, he changed the subject. If you help me with my math homework, I'll help you fix things with your son, he said with a grin. Robert raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Is that so? Yep, Daniel said confidently. It's a deal? For the first time in years. Robert laughed, a real, deep laugh that seemed to surprise even him. As the weeks went on, their routine grew. After school, Daniel would bring his books to the park, and Robert would help him with his studies. In return, Daniel would share stories about his family, his dreams, and his unwavering belief that everyone deserved a second chance. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Daniel dared to broach the topic again. Do you think your son ever wonders about you? He asked. Robert didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Maybe, he said finally, but I doubt he'd want to see me. He's better off without me." "That's not true," Daniel said firmly. "You're smart, Mr. Robert. You've taught me so much already. And you're kind. I know if I had a dad like you, I'd want to see him." Robert's throat tightened. "You don't know what you're saying, kid. I wasn't there for him when he needed me most. And when you fail someone that badly, it's hard to come back from that. But you're here now," Daniel insisted. "You're still his dad. That has to count for something." Robert looked at the boy, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" he said with a faint smile. Daniel shrugged. "I guess so, but I think you need someone to be stubborn for you." For the first time in years, Robert felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. One evening, Daniel rushed home after finishing his math homework with Robert. He burst into the tiny apartment, his backpack bouncing against his side. Maria was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans while Luana sat at the table, carefully coloring with crayons that were no more than stubs. "Mom," Daniel called out breathlessly. Maria turned, startled by his sudden entrance. "What is it, Daniel? Are you okay?" "It's Mr. Robert," he said, dropping his bag onto the floor. "I think he's really sick." Maria's expression shifted from concern to alarm. She put down the wooden spoon and walked over to her son. "Sick how?" "He was coughing a lot today," Daniel explained, his words tumbling out quickly. "And he looked so tired. He wouldn't say anything, but I could tell something's wrong. He needs help." "Mom," Maria sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze drifted to the small kitchen, the nearly empty pantry, and the pile of unpaid bills on the counter. There was so little she could give, but she knew she couldn't ignore her son's plea. "Okay," she said firmly. "Let's see what we can do." She rummaged through the cabinets, pulling out a jar of dried herbs and a small container of honey. "This is what my grandmother used to make for a bad cough," she said, more to herself than to Daniel. "And I'll make a soup. It's not much, but it might help." Daniel watched as his mother worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Though their lives were hard, Maria always seemed to find a way to give, even when there was nothing to spare. An hour later, armed with a steaming thermos of soup and a small jar of herbal tea, Daniel and Maria made their way to the park. The sky was a deep indigo, stars just beginning to dot the horizon. The streets were quieter now, with only the occasional bark of a dog or the hum of a distant car. When they reached the park, Daniel spotted Robert right away. He was slumped on the bench, his shoulders hunched against the chilly night air. His coughs rattled through the silence, harsh and unrelenting. "Mr. Robert," Daniel called. Running ahead, Robert looked up slowly, his eyes glassy and sunken. "Daniel," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing out here so late?" Before Daniel could answer, Maria stepped forward, her arms full of the makeshift remedies. "We heard you weren't feeling well," she said gently. "I'm Daniel's mother, Maria." Robert's expression was a mix of surprise and embarrassment. He struggled to sit up straighter, but the effort made him cough even harder. "You didn't have to come," he said between wheezes. "I'll be fine." Maria frowned. "You don't look fine," she said, her tone firm but kind. She handed him the thermos and unscrewed the lid. "Here, it's just soup, but it'll warm you up." Robert hesitated, his pride warring with his gratitude. But the smell of the soup, rich and comforting, was too much to resist. He took the thermos with shaky hands and sipped carefully. This is good," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maria sat down on the bench beside him, placing the jar of tea in his lap. "This is for later," she said. "It'll help with your cough." Robert stared at her, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. You don't have to say anything. Maria replied, Daniel talks about you all the time. You've been helping him with his studies, haven't you? Robert nodded. He's a smart kid, just needs a little guidance. Well, consider this my way of saying thank you, Maria said, giving him a small smile. But you need to take care of yourself, too. You won't be much help to anyone if you don't. Robert's throat tightened, and he looked away, ashamed. I've spent so many years not taking care of anything, he said quietly. Sometimes I think maybe this is just what I deserve. Maria shook her head. No one deserves to suffer like this, she said firmly. Whatever happened in your past, it doesn't mean you stop fighting. You still have a chance to change things. You just need to let people help you. Daniel, standing nearby, chimed in. You've been helping me, Mr. Robert. Let us help you now. Robert looked at the boy, then at Maria, and something in him shifted. For so long, he had felt invisible, like a shadow moving through the world. But here were these people, strangers, really, who saw him, who cared. Thank you, he said finally, his voice trembling. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you. Maria patted his arm. Just promise me you'll drink the tea and eat something every day, she said. And if it gets worse, you'll let us know. No arguments. Robert chuckled weakly. Yes, Mom. As they left the park that night, Daniel glanced back at Robert, who was still sitting on the bench, holding the thermos like it was a lifeline. He looked frail, but there was something different about him now, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. You did a good thing tonight, Mom, Daniel said as they walked home. Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. So did you, Daniel. Never forget how much kindness can mean to someone. Daniel nodded, her words settling deep in his heart. He didn't know it yet, but that small act of kindness would set something extraordinary into motion. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Robert. The cool breeze coming through the cracked window made him shiver as he dressed quickly, determined to check on his friend before school. Grabbing a piece of bread from the kitchen, he slipped out of the apartment quietly, not wanting to wake Maria or Luana. The park was serene in the early light, dew glistening on the grass like tiny crystals. Robert was sitting on the bench as always, wrapped in his threadbare coat. Though he looked better than the night before, the thermos Maria had given him sat beside him, empty but clean. Morning, Mr. Robert, Daniel called, jogging up to him. Morning, kid, Robert replied, his voice stronger today. You were out early. I wanted to make sure you were okay, Daniel said, plopping down beside him. Robert smiled faintly. I am, thanks to you and your mother. As they talked, Daniel noticed a folded newspaper lying on the ground near Robert's feet. It was old and crumpled, its pages yellowed from time. Daniel picked it up out of curiosity and began flipping through it. He wasn't much of a reader, but one page caught his attention, a photograph of a man standing in front of a sleek rocket ship. Hey, I've seen this guy before, Daniel said, holding up the page. Isn't he that billionaire everyone talks about? The one who builds spaceships. Robert froze. His body stiffened, and his hands clenched the edge of the bench. Daniel noticed the change immediately. What's wrong, Mr. Robert? Nothing, Robert said quickly, his voice strained. But Daniel wasn't convinced. He studied the photograph again. The man in the picture, with his sharp features and confident smile, looked strangely familiar. There was something in his eyes, something that reminded Daniel of someone else. Wait a second, Daniel said slowly, turning to Robert. This guy, he kind of looks like you. Robert's face went pale. He looked away, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Mr. Robert, Daniel said carefully, is he your son? The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shaky sigh. "Yes," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Elon. My son." Daniel's mouth fell open. "Elon as in Elon Musk? The guy who makes rockets and cars? That Elon?" Robert nodded, his expression heavy with guilt and sadness. "I don't understand," Daniel said, shaking his head. "If he's your son, why are you here? Why aren't you with him?" Robert swallowed hard, his throat tightening as years of regret came rushing back. "Because I failed him," he said, his voice cracking. "I wasn't there when he needed me most. I made mistakes, big ones. I put my own pride and selfishness above everything else. And by the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. He didn't need me anymore." Daniel stared at him, trying to process the revelation. "But he's your son," he said finally. "He has to care about you, doesn't he?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe once, a long time ago, but now he's got his own life, his own world, a world I don't belong in." "That's not true," Daniel said firmly. "You're his dad. That has to mean something." Robert let out a bitter laugh. "You're a good kid, Daniel, but the world doesn't work that way. People like me, we don't get second chances." Daniel frowned, his mind racing. He couldn't understand how someone as brilliant and kind as Robert could feel so undeserving. And he couldn't shake the feeling that Elon needed to know the truth. "You can't just give up," Daniel said after a moment. "If he knew where you were, I'm sure he'd want to see you, or he'd want nothing to do with me." Robert said flatly. "You don't know that," Daniel insisted. "But how will you ever find out if you don't try?" Robert sighed deeply, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. "It's not that simple, kid," he said. "It's been years, decades. I wouldn't even know where to start." Daniel sat quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the newspaper. An idea began to form in his mind, one that filled him with equal parts excitement and nerves. "What if I wrote to him?" Daniel asked suddenly. Robert looked at him sharply. "What?" "I could write him a letter," Daniel explained, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I could tell him about you, about how smart and kind you are. Maybe he doesn't know how much you miss him." "If he knew, no," Robert said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You can't do that." "But why not?" Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. "What if it works?" Robert shook his head, his face set with a mixture of fear and shame. "It's too risky," he said. I can't face him. Not like this." Daniel wanted to argue, but he could see the pain in Robert's eyes. He knew this wasn't a battle he could win, not yet. "All right," Daniel said softly. "I won't do anything without your permission." Robert relaxed slightly, though his expression remained troubled. But as Daniel walked home that evening, his resolve only grew stronger. He couldn't stand the thought of Robert spending the rest of his life believing he wasn't worth a second chance. Deep down, Daniel knew what he had to do. That night, Daniel lay awake in his small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. Luana's soft snores filled the room, a comforting rhythm in the stillness. But Daniel's mind was far from quiet. He couldn't shake the image of Robert, sitting on that bench, weighed down by years of regret. Elon Musk, Daniel whispered to himself, turning the name over in his mind. The man in the photograph looked powerful, unreachable, a far cry from the humble and kind Robert he had come to know. But Daniel believed in something deeper than fame or fortune, the bond between a parent and child. The idea grew louder in his head until he couldn't ignore it anymore. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the small kitchen, where Maria kept a stash of paper and pens for Luana's schoolwork. Sitting at the wobbly table, Daniel picked up a pen and began to write. Dear Mr. Musk, my name is Daniel, and I'm 11 years old. I know you are a busy man, but I'm writing to tell you something important about someone you might have forgotten. Your father. His name is Robert, and I met him at the park near my home. He's been helping me with my math homework and teaching me about engineering. He's really smart and kind. Even though he's had a hard life, he talks about you sometimes. And I can tell he misses you a lot. He thinks you wouldn't want to see him, but I think he's wrong. Everyone makes mistakes, but he's your dad, and I think he loves you very much. If you want to know more, please come to our park. I think it would mean the world to him. And to me too. Thank you for reading this. Mr. Musk. I hope you'll think about it. Sincerely, Daniel. Daniel read the letter over 3 times, his small hand trembling with nervous energy. It wasn't perfect, but it came from his heart. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into an envelope. The next morning, Daniel left early again, clutching the envelope tightly as he made his way to the bus stop. He had overheard their neighbor, Mr. Felipe, mentioning that he worked near a big office building in the city. Daniel hoped it was the right one. Morning, Mr. Felipe. Daniel called out as the man stepped out of his house. Felipe, a wiry man with kind eyes, smiled. Morning, Daniel. Where are you off to so early? Actually, I was hoping you could help me, Daniel said, holding up the envelope. I need to get this to someone important at a big company in the city. Can you deliver it for me? Felipe raised an eyebrow but took the envelope. Who's it for? Elon Musk, Daniel said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Felipe blinked, clearly taken aback. Elon Musk, the billionaire. Daniel nodded. It's really important. Felipe studied the boy's face. Then the envelope. Well, I can't promise it'll get to him, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Mr. Felipe, Daniel said, his relief evident. Felipe chuckled, shaking his head. You're a bold one, Daniel. Let's hope this works. Days passed, and Daniel said nothing to Robert about the letter. He felt a twinge of guilt every time he saw his friend, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Robert had given up on himself, but Daniel hadn't. One afternoon, as Daniel was heading home from school, he noticed a commotion near his apartment. A sleek black car was parked on the narrow street, its glossy finish shining in the sunlight. The neighbors whispered excitedly, craning their necks to get a better look. Daniel's heart raced as he approached. Standing beside the car, surrounded by a few stern-looking men in suits, was a figure he recognized immediately. Elon Musk, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. The billionaire turned at the sound of his name. He was taller than Daniel had imagined, his presence commanding yet approachable. In his hand, Elon held a folded piece of paper. Are you Daniel? Elon asked, his voice calm but serious. Daniel nodded, frozen in place. Elon crouched slightly to meet Daniel's gaze. I received your letter, he said, holding it up. You wrote about my father. Daniel swallowed hard. Why, yes, sir, he stammered. Elon's expression softened. Thank you for writing to me, he said. Where is he? Daniel's heart swelled with hope. He's at the park, he said quickly. I can take you to him. Elon straightened and nodded. Lead the way. The two of them walked side by side, followed closely by the security team. Daniel could hardly believe what was happening. As they neared the park, his excitement was tinged with nervousness. He couldn't predict how Robert would react, but he hoped for the best. When they reached the bench, Robert was there, as usual, staring off into the distance. He didn't notice them at first, but the sound of footsteps made him glance up. His eyes locked onto Elon, and his face went pale. Dad, Elon said softly, taking a step forward. Robert's lips parted, but no words came. His hands gripped the edge of the bench as though he might collapse. "Why didn't you tell me where you were?" Elon asked, his voice breaking slightly. Robert shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. I thought you wouldn't want to see me," he whispered. Elon knelt before his father, his expression full of pain and regret. "You're my dad. I've always wanted to see you." Robert sat frozen on the bench, his breath catching in his chest as he stared at the man standing before him. Elon's presence was overwhelming, like a tidal wave of memories and emotions crashing over him all at once. The sharp lines of Elon's face, his commanding posture, even the way he looked at him, it was all achingly familiar and yet so distant. "Is it really you?" Robert's voice cracked, the words barely audible. Elon crouched down, bringing himself to eye level with his father. "It's me, Dad," he said softly. "I've been looking for you for a long time." Robert shook his head, his hands trembling as he clutched the bench for support. "You shouldn't have," he muttered, his voice filled with both disbelief and shame. "I'm not worth it. Look at me, I'm nothing." Daniel, standing a few feet away, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. He wanted to say something, to reassure Robert, but he knew this was a moment that belonged to them alone. Elon placed a hand gently on Robert's shoulder. "Don't say that," he said firmly. "You're my father. Nothing changes that." Robert looked away, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I failed you, Elon. I wasn't there when it mattered. I left you and your mother to fend for yourselves. How can you forgive me for that?" Elon's jaw tightened, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "You made mistakes. I've made mistakes too, but I never stopped wanting to find you, to understand why you left. And now that I have, I'm not going to let you go again." The words struck something deep within Robert. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as the weight of years of regret finally found release. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks, and he struggled to catch his breath. "I don't deserve this," he choked out. Elon moved closer, wrapping his arms around his father in a firm embrace. "You do," he whispered. "You always have." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Robert clung to his son like a drowning man finding a lifeline, his frail frame trembling against Elon's solid presence. The years of pain, guilt, and distance melted away in the warmth of that hug. Daniel watched with a lump in his throat, his chest swelling with a strange mix of joy and relief. He had never seen anything so powerful, so raw. After what felt like an eternity, Robert pulled back, wiping his face with the sleeve of his coat. He looked at Elon, his eyes searching, as if trying to reconcile the image of the boy he once knew with the man standing before him. "You've done incredible things," Robert said, his voice still shaky. "You've changed the world. And I can't help but feel I had nothing to do with it." Elon shook his head. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "Every step I've taken, every success I've had, a part of me hoped it would lead me back to you. Even when I was angry, even when I didn't understand, I still wanted you in my life." Robert stared at him, his expression softening. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Elon replied. "Just let me help you now. Let me take care of you, the way you should have been taken care of all these years." Robert hesitated, his pride warring with his heart. But the look in Elon's eyes, genuine, full of love, broke through his defenses. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." Elon smiled, his relief palpable. He glanced over at Daniel, who had been standing silently nearby. "And you," Elon said, gesturing for him to come closer. Daniel approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "You're the reason I'm here," Elon said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Thank you for looking out for my dad, for seeing him when no one else did." Daniel shuffled his feet, suddenly shy under Elon's gaze. "I just wanted to help," he said softly. "You did more than help," Elon said. "You gave us a second chance." Robert reached out and patted Daniel's hand. "You've got the biggest heart I've ever seen, kid," he said, his voice steadier now. "Don't ever lose that." As the sun began to set, casting the park in a warm golden glow, the three of them sat together on the bench. Elon and Robert talked quietly, their voices carrying the weight of years, but also the promise of healing. For the first time in a long while, Robert felt like he belonged, not just to the world, but to something greater. He had his son back, and Daniel, sitting beside them, couldn't help but smile. He knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter for Robert and Elon, but he was grateful to have been part of the story. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Robert, a strange and unfamiliar rhythm replacing the stillness of his lonely life. Elon had arranged for a private car to take them to a modest but comfortable hotel nearby, where Robert could rest properly for the first time in years. At first, Robert resisted. "I don't need all this," he muttered as he sat on the edge of a plush bed, his hands gripping the soft covers. "I'm fine at the park." "No, Dad," Elon said firmly, sitting across from him. "You're not fine. You've spent too long convincing yourself that you don't deserve better. It's time for that to change." Robert said nothing, but the warmth of the room, the quiet hum of the heater, and the clean clothes Elon had brought him were undeniable comforts. He finally nodded. "All right, but just for a little while," Elon smiled, one step at a time. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was also changing in ways he couldn't have imagined. Word had spread around the neighborhood about the sleek black car parked in front of his home and the man who had walked down the street alongside Daniel. Though Maria tried to quiet the rumors, it wasn't long before people were calling Daniel a hero. Maria sat him down one evening, her expression both proud and worried. "Daniel," she said, "I'm so proud of you for helping Mr. Robert. But remember, it's not about what people say. It's about what's in your heart." "I know, Mom," Daniel said. "I didn't do it for the attention. I couldn't let him keep thinking he was alone." Maria hugged him tightly. "You've got a heart bigger than this whole city." Meu filho. A week later, Elon returned to the neighborhood. This time, he knocked on the door of Daniel's apartment, holding a small envelope in his hand. Maria answered, her expression nervous but polite. "Mr. Musk," she said, glancing behind her to where Daniel and Luana were sitting on the couch. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Elon said with a smile. "I came to thank Daniel again and to offer something for your family." Maria's brow furrowed. "Offer something? By now?" Daniel had come to the door, his curiosity piqued. Elon crouched to meet his eyes. "Daniel, you changed my life by helping my father, and I want to help you in return." He handed the envelope to Maria, who opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Elon's foundation, offering a full scholarship for Daniel to attend a prestigious school focused on science and technology. "This will cover everything," Elon explained. "Tuition, supplies, even transportation. You'll have every chance to follow your dreams." "Daniel," Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I don't know what to say," she stammered. Daniel's eyes widened. "Really? You mean I can learn to build things? Like bridges and rockets?" "Exactly," Elon said with a grin. "You remind me of myself when I was your age, curious, determined, and full of potential. I want to make sure nothing gets in the way of that." Daniel's face broke into the biggest smile Maria had ever seen. "Thank you, Mr. Musk. I'll work so hard. I promise I know you will, Elon said. As the weeks passed, Robert's health improved under Elon's care. He began to speak more openly about his past, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. Elon listened patiently, not just as a successful businessman, but as a son longing to reconnect. One crisp morning, as they walked together in the same park where they had reunited, Robert paused by the bench where he had spent so many lonely days. "This is where it started," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Where Daniel found me." Elon smiled. "And now it's where we start over." Robert turned to him, his expression serious. "Thank you, son, for forgiving me another chance." "You don't have to thank me," Elon said. "We're family, and family always deserves another chance." For Daniel, life had changed dramatically. He now spent his days at the new school, surrounded by books and tools that fed his dreams of becoming an engineer. But despite the opportunities before him, he remained the same kind, selfless boy who had once shared his lunch with a stranger. Every so often, Robert and Elon would visit the neighborhood, bringing gifts for Luana and spending time with Maria, who had become like family to them. One sunny afternoon, as they all sat together in the park, Robert turned to Daniel. "You know, kid," he said, "you didn't just save me. You saved something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Daniel asked, tilting his head. "Hope," Robert said simply. Daniel smiled, his heart full, and as the sun set over the park, casting everything in a golden light, it was clear that hope was something they would all carry with them from that day forward. A reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life.